Hello my dear student friends. We are continuing with the next part of the human reproduction. In this class we are going to study regarding the menstrual cycle. In the previous parts we had came to various concepts of the human reproduction that represents the male reproductive system, the female reproductive system, structure of the mammary gland. Then we came across gametogenesis, which is divided into two parts, spermatogenesis as well as oogenesis. Then structure of the sperm, structure of the ovary, Graafian follicle and ovum. After that we are coming across the menstrual cycle. Now in the first part we study what is the definition of the menstrual cycle, what are the phases of the menstrual cycle, what is menarche, menopause, and then the last part, the diagrammatic representation of the menstrual cycle, where exactly the events that occurs in the female reproductive system with respect to the hormones. Now first look at the definition of the menstrual cycle. Now menstrual cycle, generally what we say is, which already we have studied in the previous part of chapter 1, and we came across the difference between menstrual as well as estrous cycle. Menstrual cycle is nothing but it is a cyclic and rhythmic events that occurs in the female reproductive system of primates, including humans. Humans also comes under primates. Now, there is basic difference between menstrual cycle and estrous cycle, where in the menstrual cycle there is a release of blood, while in the estrous cycle there is no release of such blood. Now, with respect to the menstrual cycle, we are studying the menstrual cycle with respect to humans. So, we'll look at the definition of the menstrual cycle. Now, menstrual cycle can be defined as the process of cyclic and rhythmic changes that occurs in the reproductive system of primates. So the cyclic and rhythmic changes that occurs in the reproductive system of primates is said to be menstrual cycle. Then which are the primates? First one is apes, monkeys and man. So these three are termed as primates. Okay, so with respect to the menstrual cycle, let us study regarding its relative terms. Now, the question comes, what is menstrual cycle? Here we have its definition. What is the major characteristic of a menstrual cycle? The major characteristic feature of a menstrual cycle is bleeding. So second point comes, the major characteristic feature of a menstrual cycle is bleeding. So here we observe bleeding. That's why this is the major characteristic feature of the menstrual cycle. Okay. Now, what is the amount of blood that is released during menses? It is around 30 to 50 ml of blood. Now, in the menstrual cycle, this menstrual cycle, it occurs once in a month, and hence it is also termed as a monthly cycle. It occurs once in 28 or 29 days. Menstrual cycle occurs once in 28 or 29 days, and hence it is also called monthly cycle. Menstrual cycle in short is also called as menses. Okay, then this is regarding the brief introductory part of the menstrual cycle. Remember, it occurs once in 28 or 29 days. The standard value is 28 days. This is regarding with respect to the medical part, but in reality, in practicality, the number of days may vary. It might be around 30 days or 35 days, plus or minus 5 days is also considered as a normal menses. But according to the medical science, we are taking as the standard menstrual cycle, which occurs once in 28 or 29 days. Regarding its representation, here we have its representation. We'll look it after. Okay, then here we come across some definitions. Menstrual cycle occurs at the pubertal phase, at the sexual maturity phase, and that sexual maturity occurs at the age group of around 10 to 13 years of age, where the first menstrual cycle we call it as a menarche. The first menstrual cycle is called as a menarche. Then what is menarche? Menarche is the first menses, or the first menstrual cycle is called as a menarche, or the starting of the menstrual cycle at the pubertal phase. So it starts at the puberty meaning sexual maturity. Okay, this is called as a menarche. We come across one more term where we call it as a menopause. The second part is a menopause. So as the name says, pause meaning stop. Menopause. Meno refers to menstrual cycle. So stoppage of menstrual cycle is said to be menopause. So it is the stoppage of a menstrual cycle. The stoppage of menstrual cycle is said to be menopause. It occurs at the age of 50 years of age in the females. So menarche occurs at the puberty. This occurs during the puberty, and menopause occurs at the age group of 50 years. So this is regarding the two technical terms which will be asked for the definition type of questions. Menarche as well as a menopause. So it is a stoppage of the menstrual cycle which occurs at the age of 50 years, and a menarche is the starting of the menstrual cycle, which is also called as the first menstrual cycle, which occurs during the pubertal phase. So this is the introductory part of the menstrual cycle. Now with this, let's move on to the phases of a menstrual cycle. Suppose if we look at its phases, let's look at the phases of the menstrual cycle one by one. Menstrual cycle is divided into 4 phases. Out of that, the first phase is said to be the menstrual phase, as the title says. The first phase is said to be the menstrual phase. The second phase is a pre-ovulatory phase, proliferative phase, or it is also called as the endometrial reformation phase, or the follicular phase. Third phase is ovulatory, and the last phase is a post-ovulatory luteal or secretory phase. Now let's look at these phases one by one. So how many phases are there? There are 4 phases. There are 4 phases in the menstrual cycle. First one is menstrual phase. Now as the name says, what is menstrual phase? Menstrual phase is that condition during which the menstrual cycle occurs or bleeding occurs. Now this menstrual phase, it lasts for about 3 to 5 days out of 28 days. Now here what we are taking is, we are considering 28 days of menstrual cycle. Out of the 28 days, we are dividing these 28 days into 4 phases. So how we divide them based on the number of the days during the menstrual cycle, we are explaining that part here in the menstrual cycle. So out of 28 days is taken to be the standard menstrual cycle in the female reproductive system. This is according to the medical science. Now suppose in the menstrual cycle, if it takes once in 28 days, how we divide them into 4 phases, and what are the days, total number of days that are present in each phase. We are going to study in this part now. Now, menstrual phase, it is also called as a bleeding phase. So, menstrual phase, it is called as bleeding phase. Then why menstrual phase is called as a bleeding phase? Because the blood is released from the endometrial wall of the uterus. Why does the bleeding occurs? In the female reproductive system, we came across its parts and structure. In the uterus, there are three layers. The outer layer of the uterus is called as a perimetrium. The middle layer is called as a myometrium, which is made up of muscles. The inner part of the uterus is said to be endometrium. The endometrium, it consists of glandular cells. It is lined by glandular cells. That endometrium gets shedded off. Okay, now suppose in a glance, if we take the female reproductive system here, in the female reproductive system, on the inner side, as we know, this is lined by the endometrial wall. Now, what structure you see here, this is the endometrium, inner part of the uterus. This is the inner part of the uterus where we call it as a endometrium. During menstrual cycle, what happens? This endometrium gets shedded off, ruptured. So when it gets shedded off, when it gets ruptured, it leads to bleeding. That's why the menstrual phase is said to be bleeding phase. Shedding of the endometrial wall leads to bleeding, and hence the name menstruation or menses. Now it occurs due to shedding of endometrium. Now endometrium is the inner wall of the uterus. It gets shedded off. Then why the endometrium should get shedded off? This is because for the process of implantation, because pregnancy can occur at any month throughout the year, as a result, this endometrium, it has to, the older glandular tissue has to get shedded off. The new cells or the tissue has to be formed, so that after the fertilization, when the embryo comes, it should get implanted here. It should get holded here, and the fresh tissue can provide nourishment so that it gets implanted firmly. Otherwise, what happens if the dead tissue is there? How it gets implanted? The embryo does not get implanted. It just comes out of the uterus, where the process we call it as a miscarriage or abortions. Okay, so the embryo gets shedded off. That's why this endometrium should be formed and the fresh layer should be there. That's why in the menstruation, the endometrial layer gets shedded off. Why it gets shedded off, why it gets reformed, that you will come to know when we study the next part of it. Okay, so this is regarding the part. Then out of 28 days, as we said, menstrual cycle occurs from once in 28 days, day 1 to day 28. So we divide into 4 phases. Okay, now the first phase is the menstrual phase. So the time taken for this is, it occurs about 3 to 5 days. First 3 days or first 5 days out of 28 days. Suppose if you make day 1, 2, 3, 4, day 28. Out of these 28 days, first 3 days or first 5 days is a bleeding phase, where we call it as a menstrual phase. So it occurs up to 3 to 5 days. Okay, so this is regarding the part of the menstrual phase. So let's look at the second phase now. The second phase is said to be pre-ovulatory phase. This pre-ovulatory phase is also called as a follicular phase. This is also called as a follicular phase. Pre-ovulatory is said to be the follicular phase. Then Look at the part. As the name says, pre-ovulatory, before ovulation. Pre-ovulatory, before ovulation. Then follicular phase. In the ovum, suppose here if we take the structure of the ovary, inside the ovary, the follicle should get developed so that the follicle gets matured into graphene follicle inside which the ovum is present. So during the follicular phase, inside the ovary, the follicles gets grown to form into a matured follicle. And these follicles are called as a primary follicle, secondary, tertiary, as well as the matured follicle, which is called as a graphene follicle. These follicles should grow, these follicles should develop. So that's why we call it as a follicular phase. So this is regarding the part of the pre-ovulatory phase. Now, this pre-ovulatory phase, it occurs before ovulation, because ovulation occurs exactly on the 14th day of the menstrual cycle. So pre-ovulatory meaning before ovulation, what happens? The follicles gets developed in the ovary and matures into, and this gets matured into graphene follicle. So it gets matured into graphene follicle. Okay. Now look at the pre-ovulatory phase or in the follicular phase. Before ovulation, what happens? The follicles gets grown in the ovary. Then, apart from these, the activity in the endometrial, that means the endometrial wall that is shedded off in the first phase, menstrual phase, has to be reformed. That means reformation of endometrium also occurs in this phase. That means there is a reformation of endometrium. Endometrial wall which gets shedded off during menstruation has to be reformed here. Okay, so the activity of the endometrial wall also increases. So the endometrial wall is also reformed during that phase. Okay, so it occurs from after day 5, next is 6th to 13th day of menstrual cycle. Look at the total number of days. It occurs from 6th to 30th day of the menstrual cycle. Okay, so this is regarding the part of the pre-ovulatory phase. Now here, first part is the menstrual phase, second part is the pre-ovulatory or the follicular phase. And in the follicular phase, in the ovary, the follicles gets developed and it develops into graphene follicle. Then along with that, the activity of the endometrium increases during this phase only, because the endometrium should be reformed. Why it has to be reformed? So that if there is release of the egg, if it gets fertilized, it should get implanted in the fresh tissue. That's why the endometrial tissue has to be reformed. Okay. So this is regarding the part of the pre-ovulatory phase. Okay, now suppose if you go to the third one is the ovulatory phase. Ovulatory phase. Now as the name says, we come across a definition called as a ovulation. We come across a term called as a ovulation. What is ovulation? Release of egg or ovum from the graphene follicle. Of the ovary is called as a ovulation. Look at the process. From the graphene follicle, the ovum has to be released, because here we have the fallopian tube. Release of ovum or egg from the graphene follicle is termed to be ovulation. Okay. Then when does the process occurs? It occurs exactly on 14th day of menstrual cycle. It occurs exactly on the 14th day of the menstrual cycle. You can just make it out. Look at this. This occurs exactly on the 14th day of the menstrual cycle. That means on the 14th day out of these 28 days, the ovum is released. And just see one more point there. 14th day is the mid of menstrual cycle. Out of these 28 days, 14th is the mid of the menstrual cycle. So that's why it occurs exactly on the 14th day of the menstrual cycle. Okay. Then with this, we'll move on to the last phase. The last phase we call it as a post-ovulatory phase or secretory phase or luteal phase. Post-ovulatory phase, secretory phase or luteal phase. As the name says, post-ovulatory, it occurs after ovulation, after the egg release. Why it is called as a luteal phase? Why it is called as a secretory phase? This is because we came across the structure of the ovary. The graphene follicle, when it releases the ovum exactly on the 14th day of the menstrual cycle, the graphene follicle is converted into one more follicle. And that one more follicle, this is called as a corpus luteum, which already we know. This corpus luteum secretes a yellow color fluid which is called as a progesterone hormone. That means corpus luteum is formed only after ovulation by the graphene follicle. That's why the name luteal phase. Corpus luteum is formed in this phase and hence the name luteal phase. Then why it is called a secretory phase? Because the secretory activity or the corpus luteum secretes progesterone hormone and hence it is also called as a secretory phase. Okay, then what are the events that occurs in the post-ovulatory phase? In the post-ovulatory phase, corpus luteum starts to secrete corpus luteum secretes progesterone hormone. This progesterone hormone is called as a pregnancy maintaining hormone because it is responsible for the thickening of the endometrium. Look at this part. This hormone, when it starts to secrete, the endometrial wall in the uterus starts to become very thick because this is the bed for implantation. It becomes more thicker during this phase due to the activity of the corpus luteum. Then this occurs, it occurs from, look at the number of day. This is the 14th day which is completed here. We are taking the next day, 15th day to 28th day of menstrual cycle. It occurs from 15th to 28th day of the menstrual cycle. Now look at these phases. Out of the 4 phases, in the 4th phase, after ovulation, 15th to 28th day is the post-ovulatory phase. Then what will happen after 28th day? The next menstrual cycle will begin. The next menstrual cycle starts to begin and hence the first menstrual cycle is completed in these 28 days. Then what happens in the second menstrual cycle? Again in the next month the same process happens. Again there is a first phase, menstrual phase. The thickened endometrium gets shedded off leading to bleeding. Then second phase is a pre-ovulatory, before ovulation. Again what happens? The endometrium gets reformed. the new endometrium gets reformed, the fresh layer is formed here, starts to form. Then the activity of the follicles also increases, where a primary, secondary, tertiary and Graafian follicle is formed in the second phase, pre-ovulatory phase or the proliferative phase. It is also called as the endometrial phase also, because the endometrium starts to begin. The endometrium starts to reform. Then in the ovulatory phase, release of ovum from the Graafian follicle, which occurs exactly on the 14th day of the menstrual cycle. Okay, that's why it is called as ovulatory phase. In the ovulatory phase, nothing more changes will occur. The endometrium will be reforming continuously only. Ovum will be released. Then after that, last one, post-ovulatory. After the release of the ovum, Graafian follicle is converted into corpus luteum, hence the name luteal phase. Corpus luteum starts to secrete progesterone hormone and hence the secretory phase. And progesterone is responsible for thickening of the endometrium so that pregnancy, so that it can maintain the pregnancy if there is fertilization. The released ovum, if it is fertilized, then it gets implanted. And remember, if the female is pregnant till parturition or till delivery of the baby, there is no menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle ceases if the female becomes pregnant. Suppose if the egg or the ovum which is released in the fallopian tube, if it is not fertilized, then there is a shedding up of the endometrium which starts the next menstrual cycle. So this is regarding the events and the phases that occurs in the female reproductive system, where we call it as a menstrual cycle. Now, one more term. Here we have a diagrammatic representation of various events during a menstrual cycle. Now, this is the diagrammatic representation which is of most important as far as the need part of view is concerned. In the theoretical part, we have to draw the diagram of this. Now look at this. This is total number of days. Menstrual cycle is divided from day 1 to day 28. So 28 days of menstrual cycle. How we divide? First to 5th day. Here we call it as, this is called as a menstrual phase. First to 5th day, menstrual phase. Then from next 6th to 13th day, we call it as a proliferative phase. Proliferative phase. 14th day, ovulation. 14th day is ovulation, where we call it as a ovulatory phase. 1st to 5th day is menstrual phase. 6th to 13th day is a pre-ovulatory or a proliferative phase. Then 14th day, ovulatory phase or ovulation phase. 15th to 28th day, this is called as a secretory or luteal phase. This is how we divide into 4 phases. Okay, then what are the events that occurs during these 28 days? Look at this. Uterine events. What happens in the uterus? 1st to 5th day. Look at this. Here we have drawn within a diagram. There is bleeding. The endometrial wall gets shedded off, ruptured off. It leads to bleeding. That's why it goes on becoming thin. So thinning up of the endometrium. The diagram which we have drawn here, we have shown the endometrial wall. Here it starts to shedded off and it becomes thin. That's why the uterine events in the menstrual phase, the endometrium gets thinned as it gets shedded off. Then look at the next phase. The endometrium, look at the endometrium wall. Next it goes on reforming and reforming. It goes on becoming thickening and more thickening. It has to get thickened because after ovulation, if there is a fertilization, there should be implantation. In some females, suppose if the endometrium is not thick enough to hold the embryo, then those females cannot become pregnant, and hence we call that part as a sterility. We call them as a sterile. It is due to the hormonal effects also, and many of the hormones will influence on this. What are the hormones? We'll see that part also. This is a uterine event. Menstrual phase, it decreases. Proliferative, it starts to increase. Ovulatory, it starts to increase. Secretory, it becomes completely thickened. This is the endometrial layer that we are showing in this diagrammatic representation. We call these as uterine events. This is the uterus. The events that occurs in the uterus are called as uterine events. Look at the next part. Ovarian hormone level. Ovary secretes two hormones. One is estrogen, second one is progesterone. Now look at the level of estrogen. Estrogen level will be normal in the menstrual phase. In the proliferative phase, the estrogen level goes on increasing. When it comes to the ovulation, it starts to increase. In the secretory also, it starts to increase, and the end of the secretory, it decreases. Because the follicles will be growing, ovarian follicles, primary, secondary, tertiary follicles will be growing. When the follicles will be growing, these follicles will be releasing estrogen hormone. Remember, estrogen is the female sex hormone that is responsible for the ovarian events also. It also influences on the ovarian, in the uterus also. So uterine events is also under the control of these hormones. So estrogen activity. Then look at the second one, progesterone. When these follicles secrete estrogen, estrogen also helps in thickening up of the endometrial wall, and it also controls the activity of the other sexual organs, mainly the uterus, enlargement of the uterus. Then Graphene follicle, when it converts into corpus luteum will secrete the next hormone called as progesterone. Look at the level of the progesterone. Up to 14th day, there is no progesterone. Why? Because corpus luteum is not at all formed. Corpus luteum is formed after ovulation, after 14th day. That means it starts to form from day 15. From day 15, corpus luteum starts to form. That's why when corpus luteum is forming in the ovary, it starts to secrete progesterone, and the level of the progesterone increases at the mid of the secretory phase. In the last one, as its secretion activity or progesterone hormone, when it increases, then look at this, hormone level increases here. The diagram shows the progesterone hormone increases after 14th day. It starts from the 15th day. Then meanwhile, if there is a fertilization in the fallopian tube, then the activity of the progesterone goes on increasing. What will happen if there is no fertilization here? Then this corpus luteum, where it is secreting progesterone, it gets degenerated. This corpus luteum, when it develops, it gets degenerated or regression. Regression meaning degeneration. When it undergoes regression, then when it degenerates, it stops to release progesterone, and hence the level of progesterone initially increases. After ovulation, it decreases because corpus luteum gets converted into degenerative form called as corpus albicans, and hence the level of the progesterone decreases there. Okay, so this is regarding the ovarian hormone level during menstrual cycle. Then these are the ovarian events that already we know. There is developing follicles, primary, secondary, tertiary follicle that gets matured into graphene follicle up to 13 days. On the 14th day, there is an exact ovulation. Ovum is released from the graphene follicle. This is called as an ovulation. After 14th day, 15th, 16th, up to 20th day, 28th day, corpus luteum first it is formed. Later on, if there is no fertilization, it gets degenerated or regression. Okay, so this is regarding ovarian events. What exactly happens in the ovary by the influence of these two hormones. Okay, then next is regarding the pituitary hormone level. Pituitary gland secretes gonadotropins. And which is the female gonad? Ovary is the female gonad. There are two hormones released by the pituitary gland under the control of hypothalamus, because hypothalamus will release GnRH. Remember the hormonal level during oogenesis and spermatogenesis, where we have studied. Now pituitary gland will release two hormones called as FSH and LH. These two hormones are called as gonadotropins because they stimulate the gonads. They stimulate the ovary. Then pituitary gland also releases FSH called as a follicle stimulating hormone. It also releases one more hormone called as LH, luteinizing hormone. Both these hormones will influence on the ovary, and it also controls the activity of a menstrual cycle. Now look at the first part, FSH level, follicle stimulating hormone. Its level will be normal and slowly it goes on increasing its level before the mid of the menstrual cycle. because this follicle stimulating hormone will stimulate these follicles and develops into primary, secondary, tertiary and finally into graphene follicle. That's why FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, stimulates the follicles to get developed into graphene follicle. Then after that, the FSH level remains normally and it decreases at the end of the menstrual cycle on 28th, and again its level goes on increasing in the next menstrual cycle. Then look at the second one, LH, luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone will be minimum up to 13th day, and on the 14th day, look at the peak here, its a surge, its a release gets increased, and hence with the increased level of the LH, luteinizing hormone, there is a ovulation. That's why LH is called as a ovulatory hormone. Remember, keep this in mind. LH is called as a ovulatory hormone because luteinizing hormone is responsible for release of egg from the graphene follicle. What will happen if there is no release of LH from the pituitary gland? There is no ovulation. What happens if there is no ovulation? Ovum is present in the graphene follicle, and it is what happens here is it is not the proper condition of the menstrual cycle, and here we call it as an abnormality in the hormonal level. Due to this abnormality in the hormonal level, it may lead to fluctuations in the menstrual cycle also. Okay, so here we are studying only regarding the normal conditions, so leave about the abnormal conditions. Okay, look at this. LH hormone on the 14th day, the surge means the release of LH. The surge of LH increases exactly at the mid of the menstrual cycle, exactly on the 14th day. That's why LH is said to be ovulatory hormone. And at the mid of the menstrual cycle, on the 14th day, LH surge will increase like anything so that the ovum can be released from the graphene follicle. The process is said to be ovulation. Then after that, the LH remains less. So this is regarding the pituitary hormone level. That means pituitary hormones are also responsible for controlling the menstrual cycle as well as ovulation. Ovarian hormones like estrogen and progesterone are also responsible for the controlling of the menstrual cycle. So this is the diagrammatic representation of various events during the menstrual cycle. And here we have the phases of the menstrual cycle. So this is regarding the part of the menstrual cycle. Just remember what is menstrual cycle, what is menarche, what is a menopause. It's a introductory definition level parts, and then the 4 phases, which is of most important. Now, based on the knowledge of the menstrual cycle, we have the next events where we call them as the fertilization events. After this, next we are going to the part of the fertilization, and here the level of understanding should be more how exactly it occurs. And remember, the total number of days that we have taken here, this is according to the medical science, standard medical science. It doesn't mean that the female should have only 28 days of menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle, even if it occurs once in 30 days, once in 35 days also, or once in 25 days also, it is said to be the normal menstrual cycle. But as far as the NCERT part is concerned, they have taken 28 or 29 days of the menstrual cycle, and they have given the standard explanation for 28 days. And here we go across the explanation of these standard menstrual cycle, and then we'll complete this part. So here it completes the part of the menstrual cycle, and we'll continue the later parts in the next class. Thank you.